I should warn you that I'm neither a pacifist nor anti-war. To be anti-war, one should actually oppose every war. And there are certain situations in which it is necessary to take up arms to defend. And so I'll put myself as a rationalist. I mean, every situation has to be judged on its merits. If I'm anti-war and I am opposed to NATO fighting in Afghanistan, I should also be opposed to Taliban fighting against NATO. And I don't see that there is equivalence. So please, I'm not anti-war, I'm not a pacifist either. Now, let me just say a few words about the situation, shall we call the original situation after 9/11. And that was the reason that the attacks in New York were orchestrated by Al-Qaeda. That Al-Qaeda was resident in Afghanistan, that Al-Qaeda had the protection of the Taliban. Now, I am neither a supporter of Al-Qaeda nor a supporter of Taliban, in spite of the fact that I might justify their position in some cases. I'm not a supporter. So, now, after 9/11, the American government had to do something. What should they do? And so it was decided to attack Afghanistan. And the United Nations resolution that authorized that attack authorized only the elimination of Al-Qaeda. It had nothing to do with the regime in Afghanistan. However, the Americans decided that Al-Qaeda cannot be eliminated from Afghanistan unless the regime is changed. So that is one aspect of the situation. The other is that there is an enormous amount of energy in Central Asia, and particularly in the Caspian Basin. In order to get that energy safely, and especially because Iraq is going through a war and Iran is an enemy, some other route had to be found, and the safest route would be through Afghanistan and Pakistan. And my reading of the situation is that it would have taken a huge pipeline construction through hundreds of miles of Afghanistan and then Pakistan. And you know that the one American company that specializes in building pipelines is Halliburton. And that was the company of Dick Cheney, who now happens to be vice president. So we will not say that, it was entirely economic interest, but there is a whiff of that in the air anyway. So, yes, there are American national interests. Number one, Al-Qaeda should be decimated so that they don't have the opportunity to repeat what they did in 9/11. And the second thing is that Afghanistan should be prepared so that it becomes a transit route for what the American industry and the American lifestyle needs very much. But what is our national interest? Al-Qaeda has done nothing to us. And we have enough energy of our own. We can give it to a lot of people in the world. We don't need it from the outside. What is our national interest? It has been said so many times that America is our largest trading partner. Yes, of course, America is our largest trading partner. But America doesn't take commodities from us because they're being charitable to us. They take them because they need them. And if America wouldn't take, we should be able to find other markets for them. Now, the evidence of friendliness, look what happened to softwood lumber. You know what happened. Of the 5 billion, 1.2 billion is kept there to be spent at the discretion of the White House. So we are gypped on that. What happened to durum wheat? What happened to cement? And in none of these areas we have seen any evidence of special American friendliness towards Canadian interests. So, our national interest, I just can't see any national interest of Canada. Our Prime Minister says that if we are not there, then they will be here. Logic says they will be here because we are there, not the other way. It has been said so many times in very precise language by Osama bin Laden. Now, as much as you may hate him, but this is his message, that you get out of our lands and we will get out of your lands. And where is, here. The latest, not the latest, it's June 2, 2006. And it is from a Taliban leader, Mullah Dadallah. He says, our advice to those countries who are fighting in Afghanistan is to avoid the heat of battle, because we will wreak vengeance upon them one by one. And especially addressing the Canadians, a stark warning to Canada: get out of Afghanistan and stop acting like Americans, or we will kill your soldiers one by one. We have no interest in Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, Afghan history tells us that Afghanistan has been a graveyard of all foreign aggressors. No one has been able to actually take advantage. Let me just give you a few examples of that graveyard. In 1839, the British thought that they could, quote unquote, pacify, which is clobbering the opposition into submission. That is what pacifying means, that they could pacify Afghanistan. So they went with a force. They installed their own nominee, and that was Shah Shuja. He became the king. And the British stayed until 1846, 7 years. And they thought that by now they had pacified Afghanistan. And then they decided to leave. Now, those of you who have been to Afghanistan, I think this young lady has been. So Kabul is on a plateau. And in order to get out, you have to come down the plateau, which means that you can't move large forces in formation. The Afghans made sure that the withdrawing forces would not leave Afghanistan alive. They killed every member of that force, leaving one engineer to straggle across to the border to tell about the tragedy. Well, as the British left, so did Shah Shuja. And Dost Muhammad came back. Now, in 1980, the Soviets decided that they had the might of a superpower with them. They were there for 8 years. They suffered horrendous losses. And as a matter of fact, the beginning of the unfolding of the Soviet Union took place in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The invasion actually bankrupted the Soviet economy, which meant that they had to do something about it, and doing something about it, nice as a person though Gorbachev may be, but he was not a clear thinker, and so the end result was that the Soviet Union was gone. Anyway, now, after all of this, when the Soviets had gone, and there is nominee, what was his name? I forget. Anyway, he was hanged and killed under various tribal formations. The Gulabuddin Hekmatyar, the Burhanuddin Rabbani, Jalaluddin Haqqani, these are leaders of tribal factions. They had fought it out and killed a large number of Afghans. That is when the Taliban appeared in 1994, and what they did was they provided a measure of security, protecting people against looting and raping by the warlords, and in return, people accepted the harsh interpretation of Sharia law that the Taliban imposed. So it was a bargain between security and that harsh and austere interpretation. That's what the Taliban did. the Northern Alliance, which was headed by Burhanuddin Rabbani, and its military genius was Ahmad Shah Massoud, had been beaten by the Taliban and pushed to about 5–10% of the north. And this was called the Northern Alliance. And at that time, since the Americans had been able to take control of practically all of Afghanistan, the discussions about what should be the arrangement for a new Afghanistan. The Americans, and at that time, Zalmi Khalilzad, who is now American ambassador in Baghdad, was ambassador in Kabul, and though he's originally an Afghan, he didn't take these factors into account because perhaps they were not in the interest of what we call the American neocons. And that is that over the years of all of this fighting, there was no focal point of legitimate authority in Afghanistan. And the most important thing was the restoration of some mechanism that at least a segment of the Afghans would feel like owing allegiance to it. The king, the old king, who had been deposed by his own cousin in 1973 after having reigned for 40 years, was back. And from all the factors taken into account, the best thing for Afghanistan would have been a restoration of the king. But Zalmi Khalilzad pressured the king to step aside in favor of Hamid Karzai. Now, Hamid Karzai, you should know, is a former UNOCAL official, number one. Number two, though he is a Pashtun, he is not a Pashtun from the south of Afghanistan, from where the real Pashtun come. He is a Pashtun from the north. Well, I mean, Quebecers and Francophones in Alberta. I mean, you can see the parallel here. So, Karzai was installed, and the king was forced to step aside, which means that basically the government that is now in power, if we can call it so, is a reshaped Northern Alliance with Karzai at its top. A government that the majority of the Afghans under the Taliban had rejected. And of course, on top of all of that, warlords and drug smugglers are part of this government, and the amount of corruption and ineffectiveness of the government makes the people support the Taliban. Now, the argument that the Americans offer is that we cannot leave Afghanistan in this shape, otherwise it will again become a hotbed of Al-Qaeda. There were certainly opportunities in the past to gain the confidence of the Afghans and to provide for reconstruction that would have enabled them not to be attracted to Al-Qaeda. After the Soviets left in 1988, there was opportunity for Afghan reconstruction. And none of the Western countries came forward with any plan or proposal or money for reconstruction. And so Afghanistan was left to become basically a total area, an area of total anarchy. So nothing was done at that time. As I just said, the king was pushed aside. But the most important thing is, for securing security in Afghanistan, what is essential is that there should have been Muslim soldiers from Muslim countries who could sit down with the average Afghan on the dirt floor and eat out of the same plate, the same food that the Afghan is eating, and when it is time for prayers, they can stand up with the Afghans and offer prayers. And that is what creates bonds, and especially in the case of a society as traditional, as old-fashioned, and as religious as Afghanistan is, this was totally ignored. What do we have now? We have white boots. Think of it. First came the Soviets, white boots. They came with the plan of what should you call, creating a workers' paradise. For example, abolishing bride price, forcing women into universal literacy, doing things of the other kind that would sound very well in Moscow or maybe even London or Paris, but they don't sound very well in Afghanistan. It's a violation of Afghan cultural values. We may not like them. They are not coming to tell us that we should not have teenage pregnancy and single parent families. Leave them to themselves. We have not been designated by God Almighty to reform the whole world and turn it into our image. Anyway, first came the white boots under the Soviets. Then came the Americans, the white boots. Then came NATO, the white boots. Then came Canadians, the white boots. To expect that to an Afghan, the Canadians would look any different from the Americans, or from NATO, or from anybody. I mean, the height of our imaginative folly is, blatant. We think that we are such good doers that everyone in the world should see us as doing good and being in Afghanistan doing good. And then we have the same forces that are fighting. Blowing up a house, blowing up a family. And then we think we can go and distribute candy to Afghan children and be seen as friends. Afghanistan, in all its independent history of 2.5 centuries, has always been ruled by the Pashtuns. Make a point of it. Pashtuns, for 1.25 century by the Muhammadai clan of the Pashtuns, for the second 1.5 century by the Saddozai clan of the Pashtuns. And the Pashtuns are the Pashtuns of the South. And they constitute something like 40 to 45% of Afghanistan, and most of them are Taliban. There are as many Pashtuns in Afghanistan as there are in Pakistan. And the whole border area from the north to the south is populated by people who are cousins of each other across the border. Historically, herders called pavindas have been carrying their herds across the border wherever there was grazing ground. That border has never been closed, and I do not see how anyone can close that border. And if the Americans were so keen on closing that border and denying the Taliban or the Al-Qaeda any sanctuary in Pakistan, they should have done it instead of going on to Iraq and attacking another country. Why didn't they do it? Now, to expect that Pakistan would do it is to expect from Pakistan that Musharraf, the president, would be so stupid as to destabilize his government as well as his own country and have a rebellion of Pakistani Pashtun on his hands. And the Pashtun areas, the British never were able to control them. That is why they are called tribal areas, and they run on their own. And I have traveled a little bit in all those areas. I mean, the British must keep to the paved road, and the moment they left the paved road and went onto the unpaved part, down. Now, you can, I mean, America and Canada can blame Pakistan as much as they like, but if I understand the politics of that region at all, I can assure you that no government of Pakistan is going to undertake the welfare of American or Canadian soldiers at the cost of its own citizens' well-being and at the cost of its own stability. Therefore, that is a wish that will not be that cannot be fulfilled. And so, I mean, let the Americans do their job. We have no interest in Afghanistan. The American neocon strategy has been to basically take control of this area. Remember the axis of evil? And of course, the axis of evil contained Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And I don't think Fidel Castro has ever been so humiliated by Americans as by his exclusion from the axis of evil. Now, the Americans went after Iraq when they knew fully that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The 10-year embargo imposed by the United Nations had rendered Iraq totally incapable of repairing or producing or importing any weapons. They didn't go against North Korea. And now Condoleezza Rice goes from capital to capital, essentially begging for the governments of Japan and South Korea and China to do something. But you can see, the Americans can't do much. And now they are angling to invade Syria and Iran. So one day the news comes that no option has been taken off the table. The next day the news comes that the American government is seeking cooperation and help from Syria and Iran in order to lower the insurgency in Iraq. So, I mean, the people you are despising and you are going to hate them, and then you want them to help you. Well, it may be very, very far-fetched, and a lot of people want to see it that way or agree with me. But I think Samson had actually done the damage, and the first little pebbles from the temple have started to fall, and the temple is cracking. On the diplomatic front, the Americans have lost the ability to influence countries to do their bidding. On the military front, they have so overextended themselves that in spite of all the wishes they may have, they have no ability left to really attack either North Korea or Iran. And on the financial side, I mean, here is the world's largest debtor country in history. Something like 700 billion, a third of which is held by China and another third by Japan. Now what happens when the checks come and they want cashed? Because as you know, because the American dollar has been the dominant currency in the world, so everybody, in order to buy on the world market, had to accumulate the American dollars, which means that everybody had to sell commodities to the Americans, whereas all the Americans had to do was to print dollars so that people would have. At one time, Britain, the British pound, was the dominant currency of the world. But when Britain started to lose their dominant position, their trade was in surplus. America, when it is starting to lose the dominant position, its trade is in terrible deficit. And there's a huge debt. So maybe 20 years, 30 years, who knows? But these are the little steps that eventually contribute to that situation which Britain has experienced in the last century and others have experienced in the past. Now coming back to the final point. My view is that we should waste no resources, either money or lives, in Afghanistan. And my opposition is not directed towards the soldiers, because the soldiers didn't decide to go on their own. This is a political decision and the political leaders have taken. The soldiers are fighting bravely, and they're even identifying with the cause, which actually is no cause, because never Al-Qaeda or the Taliban had anything to do with us. I mean, we live in a cocoon of total mediocrity, and we live in this comfortable world of anonymity. Let us live in that. And let us not try to play the big boys on the world stage where the cost is very heavy. Thank you very much.